All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Picture This, Unlocking the Cross-Disciplinary Potential of ArtStore on JSTOR. My name is Alex Houston, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at JSTOR. And before we dive in, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. So this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available to you after the event. If you need technical support during the event, please enter a comment in the question box. You can also use that question box to submit questions throughout the session for us, for our speakers, or you can hold them for our dedicated Q&A, which will happen at the end. Now let's get started. Next slide, please. So today we're going to explore how ArtStore on JSTOR can enhance teaching and research across a variety of disciplines. We're excited to be joined today by two experts. We have Whitney Barlow Robles, a historian, author, curator, and a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College, and Blair Woodard, associate professor of history and environmental studies at the University of Portland. They'll share how they use images in their classrooms to enrich student learning and offer practical tips for teaching, whether you're working online, in person, or in a hybrid classroom. During the Q&A and in the chat, we'll also be joined by ArtStore on JSTOR experts who can help get your questions answered. So we have with us Dana Howard from our education team, as well as Rumika Hillier from our marketing team. And next slide, please. Before I hand things over to our speakers, I do want to take a moment to consider some of the key challenges that educators are facing today and that ArtStore on JSTOR is able to help with. First, we have media overload. Students are constantly bombarded with images and information from countless sources. This overwhelming stream can create stress and make it difficult for them to identify credible information. Next, there are literacy gaps. So while students are exposed to tons of media daily, many are lacking the essential media and visual literacy skills that they need to critically evaluate and engage with this content. Then we have the need to teach complex concepts, but limited tools to do so. So many subjects, of course, require conveying abstract ideas, which can be hard to grasp with text alone. Research shows that visuals can greatly enhance understanding, but educators often lack access to quality visuals that make this possible. Finally, there are diverse learning needs. Every student learns differently, of course, and educators are tasked with finding tools and methods that cater to a variety of learning styles to ensure effective education for all. Next slide, please. ArtStore on JSTOR offers innovative solutions to these challenges that educators and students are facing today. First, it offers curated, trustworthy content. With millions of rights-cleared images and multimedia alongside scholarly texts, ArtStore on JSTOR ensures students have reliable tools for analysis and learning. Second, it supports media and visual literacy. By integrating textual and visual resources, ArtStore on JSTOR can help students critically evaluate and interpret visuals, equipping them with these essential skills that they need in the world today. And then finally, ArtStore on JSTOR helps make complex ideas more accessible. Its rich visual and multimedia resources make even the most challenging topics, whether in science, history, literature, or beyond, more engaging and easier to understand. Next slide, please. And while ArtStore has traditionally been associated with the arts, for obvious reasons, its name, it's really valuable across a wide range of fields. So this summer, we actually asked our community to share how they're using ArtStore on JSTOR across disciplines. And the responses we got were really inspiring and enlightening. So just a couple of examples are on the screen here. From English as a second language teachers, we heard from educators who are using ArtStore's images to introduce vocabulary and grammar to make lessons more accessible and engaging. In political science, and specifically in urban planning, we heard from educators who are using ArtStore's urban design images to discuss city planning and provide visual context for some theoretical ideas. In theater studies, we heard from professors using visual references to analyze scenes from plays, helping students understand the theatrical contexts. And then finally, in dance studies, this is one of our favorites to learn about, instructors are using performance photos from ArtStore to guide discussions and recreations of choreography, really blending theory and practice in an interesting way. These examples really highlight ArtStore's versatility and its value across various fields, supporting this dynamic interdisciplinary approach to teaching that, again, our speakers will kind of demonstrate in a bit more detail. And with that, I will turn things over to our speakers to show out how these ideas are playing out in their classrooms, starting with Whitney.
All right, and can everyone see my screen? Are you able to see the Chrome screen now?
Can you share and reshare, please?
Yes, I'm getting cut off again.
Yes.
How's that look?
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. So thanks for confirming. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Whitney Barlow Robles. I'm a historian of science and natural history. And I've used images as well as three-dimensional artifacts quite a bit in my teaching. And I found both to be a really kind of palpable, immediate feeling gateway for students into the past. And I think images in particular are a powerful teaching tool, not only for classrooms full of art history or even history majors, but really for all students. And I'll focus in particular on STEM students today. I've found that images really get STEM students invested in humanistic questions. So for a number of years at Dartmouth College, I taught a course called Reading Artifacts, the Material Culture of Science. And the course was partly a practicum on how to look, how to read things that are not strictly textual. And it was also a history of museums and scientific collecting in particular. And as you might guess from the title, it brought a mix of humanities and science students. We'd spend about half of our sessions in collections, looking at artifacts and artworks in person. And even our quote unquote normal classroom time was still very image heavy. I did teach this class in spring of 2021, where everything was remote still at Dartmouth at that point. So we were learning how to read artifacts almost exclusively through a screen. And thanks to resources like ArtStore, it actually worked out beautifully. So today I'd like to use ArtStore to do two different demos. I will give some examples of how I've used images in my classroom, both in terms of a reading response that I've implemented in the past, as well as a small group activity. Before I get to those demos, by way of background, I want to tell you just a bit about the foundational assignment in this course. It's not one that I've used with ArtStore in the past. I have students go in person to look at something in a museum or collection, but you certainly could do this with ArtStore, and I think ArtStore is a great tool, especially for those institutions that may not have robust collections that are accessible to students. So when students start out in my class, their first assignment is something called a close looking exercise. They have to find an object they have in-person access to and spend at minimum 60 minutes looking at it. Many go much longer, through the attempted perspective of an intelligent alien observer who has no idea what this object is. They run through a series of questions that I provide, which start very small and observational. Things like, what color is it? What are its dimensions? Does it have multiple components, and how do they fit together? Does it have any inscriptions on it? And then they build up over time to the for what question of, does it appear to have some sort of use you could speculate on? And finally, so what? Stepping back, asking them to think about what that forced perspective helped them see. And really, I would say the best submissions are the ones that conclude, like, for example, this water bottle is not a water bottle, but maybe it's the exoskeleton of an extinct life form, which is totally a valid conclusion you might arrive at based on close looking alone. So the goal of the assignment is to defamiliarize the familiar, because at first some students go in thinking this assignment is sort of simple and rote, they're just going through a checklist. but really looking is difficult intellectual work. It asks them to question the very foundation of how they come to know what the objects in the world around them are. And then that's a lesson that carries throughout the course. So since this course gives students a foundation in the history of museums, one of our units towards the beginning is about curiosity cabinets and the so-called Wunderkammern or wonder chambers of the Renaissance and early modern period. These odd, seemingly mishmash kitchen sink collections that were the forerunners of more modern looking museums that would emerge in the 19th century, but which also looked very different. So for 1 week, they read about these curiosity cabinets and the sorts of items that went into them, not just animal and plant specimens, but weaponry, artwork, articles of human clothing, sometimes food, oddities, really anything that could show human handiwork or God's handiwork or the conversation between the two. And they read a variety of secondary sources to introduce them to this material. So I want to do a demo where we use ArtStore or something similar in our course to do a reading response on our LMS, which is Canvas in the case of Dartmouth. So students have to, for their reading response, find a pre-1800 artifact or a pre-1800 image that reminded them of the readings. And then they have to explain why and quote at least one reading. And they post this write-up and their image on the discussion board before class. So let's do a demo within ArtStore to think about what kinds of things they might find. I'm going to go ahead and make sure this Images tab is selected here. And let's say we have a biologist in the class. I've had many. I had one biologist named Arthur who will still email me periodically and say, Professor, look at what I found in a museum today. So let's use Arthur as our muse a bit today. And I know Arthur is passionate about animals, and so it's reasonable to think he might start with a keyword like natural history specimen. So let's go ahead and put that in and see what we get. In some sense, we get a modern day curiosity cabinet. Things from very different provenances and different eras, different formats, different fields of study, different genres, as it were, from the botanical to the zoological to the ethnographic. But remember, they have to find something that predates 1800. So on the left-hand panel here in gray, there are various filters. I'm going to choose this one that says date and click the drop down. And I'll put the upper bound at 1800 and click apply. Now I'm getting a lot of botanical prints, a lot of Sidney Parkinson, who was an artist on Captain Cook's first voyage. And if I'm Arthur, I'm not all that interested in plants. So I might at this point say, you know what, maybe I need to tweak my keywords. So I'm going to take out natural history and simply look for specimen, and then once again narrow the date to before 1800. I get some very different hits now, really interesting, but more anthropological, archaeological in nature. So again, I'll continue to play around with the different filters. There's one called classification on the left here. And if I'm Arthur, I see one that says science, technology, and industry, which sounds more promising than fashion, costume, and jewelry or paintings above and below it. So, I actually did click fashion. Let's do science, technology, and industry. This really narrows it down to just a handful of objects. So you see, we get some really difficult objects here with these skulls. And in fact, images give us a really powerful tool for talking about the colonial history of museums and how looking itself could be literally objectifying in a very violent way. And this unit in particular, although it's true of all the units in the course, take a hard look at the ties between slavery and collecting and settler colonialism and collecting. And some students really gravitate towards those objects and will nominate those in the reading response. If I'm Arthur though, let's say I'm a student researcher with a professor and I use a lab, in the lab I use a microscope all the time. And I see something here labeled microscope, but it looks nothing like the microscope I'm accustomed to seeing. So if I'm Arthur, I'm going to go ahead and choose this fascinating, bewitching object I found, even though it was different from what I anticipated I might find. We'll talk about this microscope in one moment. I want to pause here to say This assignment has a few ulterior motives other than simply getting students to do some of the readings. One is to get students immersed in the world of objects out there and the possibilities for their final projects, where they have to choose a cornerstone artifact and either write a research paper about it, create a digital exhibition where that object is the fulcrum, so to speak, or do some sort of reenactment or making exercise. Another point of this assignment is simply to teach them how to use the search functions and filters to find resources for this course. And here's where librarians are absolutely vital. Dartmouth has the most wonderful librarians, and they'll actually come into my course and do exactly this sort of demo for students. Finally, I think you're seeing that the very act of looking for images can be a teachable moment. A question I might pose to students when we convene is, what do you make of the fact that Artstor is a kind of modern curiosity cabinet? Have the categories of the Wunderkammern ever really gone away? Then in class, after every student has posted their image and their reading response, I will take all the images from the LMS, I'll put them on a single PowerPoint slide as a collage, and I'll project that behind me for our discussion. And with that as a kind of visual prompt, we can get into the nitty-gritty of what in the world were these curiosity cabinets, what was in them and why, what the heck were people doing in these spaces? And I will say every time that I've taught this class, this strategy, both of having the reading response done in advance and then that collage behind me, it always gets every single student to talk because they know their object or image. They chose it for a reason amidst the sea of objects. They're excited about their choice. So before we move to the next demo, let's quickly go to Arthur's microscope. This is not what he actually chose, but if he had, what might his reading response say, or what might we discuss about it in class? One theme we'll discuss is how these objects weren't just static artifacts sitting behind glass, sort of hermetically sealed away from the paws of visitors. We read this amazing piece by Constance Classen that week about the role of touch in the early museum. So the objects in curiosity cabinets were meant to be handled, looked at, turned over in one's hands, used in research like this microscope, eaten in the case of food, sometimes given out as gifts. It's a very different museological philosophy than most museums today, although some science museums and children's museums do have, you can touch things, you can put things under the microscope. So there are some through lines we could discuss too. But also just look at this microscope. I mean, it is an object lesson and kind of artwork on its own that we could analyze as a class. This is not your SEM microscope in a lab today. It's ornate. Look at the lines and the silhouette. It is gilt. If we zoom in here, apologies, my cat has just appeared. The barrel is covered in a sumptuous shagreen, which is made from shark or ray skin. It's used to afford a better grip on the microscope. It's also used for samurai swords. And there's this ornate case. Even the case is a showstopper. So there's a lot that we could look at in terms of the image itself, but then we also have this related images section beneath the microscope. So using these objects kind of in concert with the microscope, we can have a conversation about these curiosity cabinets as a kind of display of enlightenment and gentility and learnedness and worldliness. But also you can see how these were spaces of exclusion and exclusivity. And if we go to the bottom left, there's also a feature called related text that will take you to a JSTOR article. And exactly to that point, there's a journal article called Science and Luxury. So that's one example of how this seemingly small assignment can open up all of these possibilities for student wonder and exploration and practical tool learning, and also just learning how to look at a basic level. And then also these more difficult discussions about difficult histories of racism and resource exploitation and dispossession. I want to finish here by doing one final demo, which is related to a small group activity. I love breaking students into small groups where they can really get into the weeds with an image. So I'm going to break them into, say, 3 groups and ask those small groups to take 5 minutes just to look at an original rendering of a curiosity cabinet and talk about what sorts of objects they see. Each group will get a different image. And then they'll take 5 to 10 minutes to decide which 3 artifacts from the scene that they would nominate to include in an exhibition to their classmates about the state of collecting in this period. So as a historian of this period, I kind of know which images I want to distribute, but let's say as an educator, I did not, and I could use Artstor for myself to find materials for teaching. So I'm going to type in curiosity cabinet, and we get some literal cabinets. This first hit here is a modern kind of response to or reworking of the curiosity cabinet concept. So that could be a great model for final projects. I'm going to go ahead and filter one more time by date, pre-1800. I get some really fascinating prints. I'm scrolling through here and I see a rich looking scene. So this is a quite famous frontispiece from the work of a Danish physician and collector, Ole Worm, from 1655. So I'll make that full screen. And wow, there is so much to dig into here. So I'll start walking around the room as students begin to look. They can call on me and say, you know, professor, like, who is this guy? I'll explain that's an automaton, essentially an early modern robot. There's so much to simply look at in a scene like this. So rather than sitting there and trying to recall from the readings the lists of objects that they read about, here it is laid before their eyes and ready for analysis. And students can take this in many different directions. They might talk about space constraints, right? All of the long things, the canoe, the shark, the kayak have to go on the ceiling. Or they might talk about grouping by material composition. Everything that's bony is on the left-hand side. You've got antlers, powder horns, a walrus skull. There's even a little chair on the floor. It's made out of a whale's vertebra. Like, what's up with that? They could talk about. They might discuss this parallel I was alluding to between human artistry and godly artistry and mechanism as literally embodied in that automaton. Or they might talk about the cosmopolitan reach and the global nature of this collection and the extraction required to assemble a space like this. So if you look at the top, there is a polar bear cub up here. So maybe I have some biologists in one group and they want to discuss curiosity cabinets and extinct or endangered animals and the Anthropocene and climate change, those sorts of themes. They could start with the polar bear, but we have a lot of different candidates. There's also this armored fish in the top left here. This is a sturgeon, by some measures, one of the most endangered animal groups in the world. Likewise, this wall has a lot of different natural history options. There's a kind of serrated weapon, it seems. This is actually the beak or rostrum of something called a sawfish. It's a type of ray. That was a must-have item in any curiosity cabinet. And those are also some of the most endangered fish in the world today. So collecting certainly didn't do their population numbers any favors. There's also turtle shells. You'd have to do a species ID, but 50% of chelonian species, which is to say tortoises and turtles, are faced with endangerment and threatened with extinction today. Finally, there next to the sawfish beak, there's something that looks like a penguin. This is a great auk. It is an animal that went extinct in the 19th century, so quite a while after this image was made. Ole Worm actually had a few great auks. He had one that he would walk around with a leash. So we have this snapshot here of this rich cornucopia of animals that are about to face human pressures that will drive them to the brink. It's a really fun image to work with, but it's also a kind of tragic parable of what's to come. These curiosity cabinets were the original interdisciplinary spaces. And STEM students can really sink their teeth into an image like this and perhaps even offer expertise that their humanities peers might not have. So it's going to be the biologists that know the current plight of sawfishes and sturgeon. So it's images like this that help the past come to life for students. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Blair now. Thank you.
All right. Hello. Thanks, Whitney. I'm Blair Woodard, and I'm from the University of Portland, and I'm going to be talking today about my research and also how I use images in both research and teaching in my classroom. I'm a U.S. Latin American relations historian. I look at the United States and Cuba, the United States and Mexico, and the borderlands, all of which have a wealth of images to draw on. And really, my interest is in looking at how everyday people come to understand these relationships. And a lot of times these are from images, right? So either through television or newspapers or magazines, definitely in my time period, but also advertisements and comic books and posters and billboards, and sort of this myriad of images that all comes together to really inform the public. Certainly, research for this has gotten a lot easier over time. 20 years ago, it was a lot harder to kind of like cobble together lots of these images from all sorts of different places. And ArtStore is a great resource that will make this simpler, especially for students in classrooms, and especially under sort of limited timelines of semesters or quarters in order to produce papers or do exams. So this is helpful. And also, as already mentioned, it's really good to use images with students because they're bombarded with so many these days, that as an exercise in media literacy, to look at past images and how images were manipulated or used, and then get them to think about how that is happening in their worlds today. So today I'm going to talk about popular images of US-Cuban relations from really the revolutionary period in 1957 until around 1965, and then some of the ways that I use these types of images in class. So one of the things that we start out with in my classes is the connection between the United States and Cuba prior to the revolution, and how intimate this relationship was between these two nations. And a great image that really brings that together is these images from the television show I Love Lucy, which was the #1 program in the United States in the 1950s, with over 10 million people watching, and showed an actual relationship between a Cuban American, Desi Arnaz, and then his wife, Lucille Ball. They were one of the first interracial couples on television, and they were very path-breaking in the show. It was extremely popular, and really, again, kind of demonstrated this connection between these two places. In addition to this television show, the United States and Cuba shared and still share a love for baseball. Boxing was another sport that they exchanged on. Horse racing was another thing that went back and forth between the island and the United States. And then, of course, tourism, which after World War II really took off between the United States and Cuba was widely advertised in newspapers and magazines throughout the United States as a place that people could visit very easily. And the advertisements, we in class will look at these advertisements and really analyze them. And one of the things that really like comes out and students see is, if you can see down here in the left-hand corner, is how the island is constantly touted as being very close to the United States, only 90 miles away, that there's easy transportation to get there, and that US citizens didn't need to have any passport to enter into the island. These advertisements also often had a not so subtle sexual subtext, and also, again, maps that showed these connections between the two places in order to encourage people to go there even for a weekend. Again, they didn't need to have any kind of passport, and so tourist cards were oftentimes issued by the transportation agency, in this case, the United Fruit Company, who would then allow tourists to come in to Cuba for back and forth for upwards of 2 years. This, of course, led to the abuses on the side of the United States and images of the ugly American and misbehaving on the island and sort of treating it as their own private playgrounds. At the same time, Fulgencio Batista comes back into office via coup, and this will eventually set off what becomes the Cuban Revolution with the attack on the Moncada barracks on July 26, 1953, led by, at that point in time, a not so well-known lawyer from Havana, Fidel Castro, and which would eventually again lead to his arrest and imprisonment for 2 years, but then released by Batista. And at this point, Castro then does become more well-known in the United States as he takes his July 26 movement to the United States in order to raise money for the revolution. And images like this surprise students because I don't think they realize, Castro kind of had this very much sort of an enemy image more commonly. And so that to have images of him, first of all, without a beard and going around the United States in order to raise money and showing the connection again between the United States and Cuba is something that tends to surprise students. And I think the images really help to bring that point forward. After the invasion of Cuba in December of 1956, Fidel was reported as being killed, and this newspaper story ran in the New York Times. And so the revolutionaries knew this was not true, and the revolutionaries knew that this was quite detrimental to their fundraising efforts. And so the revolution made a big effort to basically refute this story again in the New York Times. And so they brought in a journalist, Herbert Matthews, who then ran a story on the front page in February of 1957. This is quite possibly one of the more important images for the revolution. And so in my class, we take this newspaper story and we analyze it both for images and content to really show the importance and sort of what, a game changer an image can make. And so this photograph of Castro, I have them in groups. We'll break also into groups, which is a great thing to do to look at the image. And this image of Castro holding this rifle with this seemingly jungle-like background and the signature, really again to prove that he was alive and to really put him at the forefront of the revolution. So they'll look at this and analyze this. Castro was very much kind of like, touted as this singular leader, even though there were many others during the revolutionary period, but he really does become the face. And Herbert Matthews, in many ways, is responsible for creating this image and to bringing forth this idea of this sort of revolutionary leader. Within the article, there's also a map again, which really shows this idea of rebel territory, but is quite misrepresentative of how much territory was actually controlled at this time. So again, the students will look at this map and analyze this map, from here in the right-hand corner, this detail sort of indicating that perhaps it's like the entire eastern side of the island that was controlled, even though it was a very tiny place at that point in time that they had even established a beachhead of any kind. And so they'll look at this and talk about sort of how maps are not, never without bias, and that they're not neutral. And so thinking about maps themselves again, and then also the explanation of Castro, or the description of Castro that Matthews gives, and this sort of really bring him forward as quite a man, right? Powerful, 6-footer, full face with a straggly beard, and that the beard in this sort of image of these barbudos, as they were called, right, with beards, was something quite different for the public in the 1950s. It was not very fashionable for men to have beards at that point in time, whereas in the 1960s with the hippie movement and sort of like when the Beatles get beards, it becomes much more common for people to have beards. At this point, it was something new. And so they look at that and they think about these images and sort of as, and then basically the manipulation of the US media by the Castro regime. And so the Cuban government said, oh, it couldn't have happened. And so the New York Times published this photo of Herbert Matthews with Castro afterwards to prove indeed that he had been there and that he'd published this article. And after this, basically a wave of US journalists want to go there, and the Cubans, the revolutionaries, definitely support this because they know it will bring in more money and support. And so and this again surprises, I think, students, that for really 2.5 years or thereabouts, Castro and his revolutionaries are viewed as heroes within the US public, supported by these journalists. Jules Dubois from the Chicago Tribune, Andrew St. George, who was photographing for Life and Look magazines, may have been a CIA agent. That is not confirmed or not, but would definitely was sort of all over the place. And this is really the heyday of these types of photographic magazines. And then they also made a big effort to get television reporters there. Since in the 50s, television is really coming to the forefront in terms of media. So there was interviews done by CBS, and then also this also surprises students and is quite fun, is sort of the sort of the outliers and the craziness, which is Errol Flynn lived in Cuba at the time, and he himself produced a movie about the Cuban Revolution, Cuban Rebel Girls, which was quite possibly one of the worst films of all time. And so we watch a little of that in class, and that's entertaining as well. The revolution, of course, uses these photographs. They have photographers with them. And so again, manipulation of images by the revolution for their own means in order to garner support, especially in the United States, for their cause. Usually those were images of male revolutionaries, but I do make a point in class to make sure that the students know that there are a lot of women who participated actively in the revolution. So Celia Sanchez Mandalay, Vilma Espín, and Heidi Santa Maria, and showing these images of the women who not only supported but fought alongside the men during the revolution, and to talk about the roles of gender within these revolutionary movements, and to show them, as active fighters. I think the photographs definitely help them to really understand the active role that women had. After the triumph of the revolution on January 1st, or the armed phase of the revolution in 1959, Castro sets about to really change his image with the United States. And he's concerned that perhaps there will be, he's concerned obviously about the United States during the Cold War not backing them. And so he makes a big deal from going from this kind of tough fighter that you saw in the New York Times article to a much more gentle, sort of peaceful, father-like figure, and to when he was giving interviews, he really made a point to emphasize that they were friendly, that they certainly were not communist. And so one of the classic ones is this Edward R. Murrow person-to-person interview that Castro gave from the then Havana Hilton, which is now known as the Havana Libre, from the penthouse, where he was dressed in pajamas and brought his son Fidelito out with a puppy in order, again, to, try to tone down his image as the harsh revolutionary and give a much more human and softer image. He spoke in English at this point in time. So we watched this and again analyzed the images and what he's actually trying to accomplish. Right after this, he actually makes a trip to the United States in April of 1959. This is a media frenzy, and in fact, he's invited by the Association of Newspaper Reporters. It's not technically an official state visit, but he zooms around to a lot of kind of bastions of United States power. So he's in Washington, D.C., he's in New York, he visits Harvard, visits Princeton, and so he really wants to connect sort of to the U.S. people. Eisenhower chose to not meet with him at that point in time, and instead sends his vice president, Richard Nixon, who meets with him and of course proclaims that Castro was either the smartest or the dumbest communist that he had ever met, but certainly proclaims him a communist at that point in time. Castro doesn't ask for any aid at that point, which of course I think sparked Nixon's suspicions of his motives. But in this sort of honeymoon phase of this relationship lasts for a little bit of time. This again kind of surprises students when they see this, that you had comic books that were being produced again, supporting this man in the beard and this heroic image of Castro as a freedom fighter that was sort of connected to US zone struggle for freedom, and again against communism, which is seen as this great evil. to the point that even a toy producer in New Jersey made outfits with children wearing fake Castro beards and 26th of July movement outfits. This again surprises students in looking at this, and the idea that parents would dress their children up as Cuban revolutionaries is very surprising, and the images of them playing revolutionaries in the woods is also a surprising image to them. Unfortunately, not long after this, the relations between the United States and Cuba begin to sour. And an incident that takes place in Cuba on March 4th, 1960, a ship, the La Cubre, was blown up in Havana Harbor. Again, explanations of this vary as to who was at fault for this, and also whether or not the La Cubre was carrying weapons for Cuba. But what came out of this was Fidel addressing a large crowd and the creation of what becomes known as the Committees of the Defense of the Revolution. But perhaps even more famously, Alberto Korda, who's there at the time, turns as Fidel is speaking and takes 3 photographs of Che Guevara, one which becomes known as the Guerrero Heroico, the heroic guerrilla. And this image becomes the most reproduced image of all time, which then we look at many images of Che. Lots of these are available on ArtStore to be used. And this, again, just in terms of image manipulation and image reproduction and the importance of images, but again, getting away from the actual person so that Che really turns into this symbol as opposed to who he was as a person. And then basically after this point in 1960, the relations really start to go downhill quite quickly as the Cubans move closer and closer to the Soviet Union. And of course, this is going to bring the ire of the Eisenhower administration and then eventually the Kennedy administration as they begin to see Cuba as a threat looming off of the shore. And so that idea of proximity, right, that had been a good thing for tourism is turned into something negative. And even Castro's beard, which was this sort of highlight of masculine identity and him being a hero, is also changed. And so we'll look at things like political cartoons, which as images are so rich in terms of their sort of small, medium and condensed area for messaging, but can contain so much. And of course, then Castro really is turned into, from going from hero then to devil. And so after that, really, lots of real things happen between the two countries, right? Such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then also the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the images, of course, that were produced were the evidence, right? In terms of the aerial photographs of the missile sites. And then what really, of course, frightened the American public was when these maps, again, showing the proximity of Cuba to the United States, but then the range that the missiles could have in terms of firing from the island. And so talking about that, and again, the importance of images as presenting this case to the United States public. After the missile crisis, and again, political cartoons showing the removal of the missiles, in many ways, the relationship between the two countries kind of descends into a point where we basically disregard it. And this advertisement from Cunard Cruise Lines really kind of sums up the United States feelings towards Cuba for a long time afterwards, which was that they've simply disappeared it off the map and moved Puerto Rico from the east to the west and again, just disregarded the fact that Cuba was even there. And of course, the relationship goes on, and we talk much more about it. But these types of images are helpful to use. And again, a variety of in-class exercises, and then also on things like exams. And so in this case, this was a take-home exam where I had them have sort of 8 different images from Cuban history, and then they needed to couple them with readings that we had done from class, and then write an essay explaining what the images were portraying, but also along with the different historical works, either primary or secondary sources. This is something that could also be done in class, and I oftentimes these days pull out the old blue books and have them use that as well. Again, that's kind of AI proofing the assignment, but again, I think the students benefit a lot from looking at images. They seem to remember these assignments a lot, And it's a good way to make them really sort of examine not only the history, but then to also really look at their own lives, and again, the digesting of images that they're doing every day, sort of as an exercise within media literacy. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Alex.
All right. Thank you so much, Blair and Whitney, for sharing how you're using images in your teaching. And before we jump into Q&A, I did want to quickly highlight a few tools available for educators from JSTOR. All of these are free. In the chat, we will share a handout that includes links to what I'll be showing and talking to on the screen. So first, we've recently launched a hub of curated educational tools on our website. This hub of information is packed with resources that will specifically help you boost engagement, enhance learning with primary sources, foster research skills, and amplify diverse voices. Next slide, please. You can also stay updated on this ever-growing library of resources and events like this one by signing up for our occasional teaching and learning updates. That is, we will not bombard you with information, but rather share updates when we have them to make sure that you have everything you need to get the most out of the resources on JSTOR and to take advantage of those things in your classroom. Next slide, please. And then finally, you can get involved yourself. So you can join our Teaching and Learning with JSTOR LinkedIn group. Again, there are links to do these things in the handout in the chat. And in that LinkedIn group, you can connect with a growing community of educators, sharing best practices, discovering fresh ideas for using JSTOR in teaching, and other networking opportunities. And lastly, we would love to collaborate with you. You can use the form in the handout to share your expertise, ideas for co-creating teaching resources or celebrating innovative approaches in the classroom, blog post ideas, or webinars like this one. And now I will invite our presenters and my colleagues back on camera to take your questions. And we can move to our dedicated question slide. I'm currently not seeing any questions. Either I'm not looking in the right place or we have satisfied the room. All right. Seeing some things come in. All right, let's see here. I'm just going to start at the top. So I'm seeing a question about getting started with using JSTOR. So the question is, I know Whitney mentioned this, but I'm curious if you two as professors began with your JSTOR journey by talking to librarians at your university, or were you already aware of these tools?
I, for the most part, was already aware, like actually since college, I've used JSTOR in some form. That said, as I mentioned in my presentation, I always go to our school librarians for every course I teach. I have them come at least once. So I guess both. I was aware, but I'm always learning from librarians about new features, new ways to search for information, even as a historian, where I think I should know the ways. I always learn something new. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would say the same, in the sense that certainly at the beginning of my my career as a historian, these tools weren't necessarily available quite yet, because in the late 90s, the internet was still pretty much in its infancy. And so as things have changed and gotten better in that sense, I'm becoming more and more aware of tools that are definitely making this type of research simpler in many ways, and librarians are a fantastic resource for that.
Awesome. All right. Another question I'm seeing is for both of you, Whitney and Blair. What have you found to be the most challenging for students when analyzing images, and how do you best support them in that process?
I can go ahead and start. So since my presentation was about STEM students, one thing I sometimes see is, these students are so smart and they're so passionate about science as something that like progressively leads to more and more perfect knowledge over time. And so sometimes when we look at these images from 300 years ago, they can sort of approach them dismissively and say like, it was, it was just like piles of junk and they weren't scientific in the 18th century. And what did they know? But then I think images still give such a great opportunity to give those students tools to say, look, this does look different from our science today, even as there are these through lines that we'll take a look at. And it was a sort of fully coherent knowledge system at the time. And so that's one thing that I think can be sometimes difficult to work with in history of science courses, whether we're looking at images or even just looking at, in general, earlier ways of doing science. But it's also such a great opportunity to teach students about historical analysis and humanistic analysis.
Yeah, I find my students to be really good at image analysis just because I think they're so used to looking at so many images every day in their everyday lives. I find them to be quite sort of inquisitive and also suspicious sometimes of images, which is a good thing. Is that, again, because I think they know that there's a lot of manipulation that goes on with their own lives, so they're aware. And I think that, again, it's more just sort of that they are maybe a little bit, I guess, surprised at some of the images in terms of what they're seeing, and then they question those really well. And so, again, I think it's a great opportunity for sort of learning, and again, having them do, in a way, sort of image analysis, and then compare those to the readings, which then I hope help encourages them to actually read the articles as well, so that because of the explanation of the images and what's going on behind them, I think so that works out.
Awesome. And then a question about assignments. This one is, what sort of document formats are possible for students who create an assignment response or presentation? How do you sort of approach that for your assignments?
I'll let you go again, Whitney, if you want, or I can.
Oh, okay.
I think I missed the first part of that. What different document formats?
Yeah, the question was, what sort of document formats are possible for students who create an assignment response or presentation? So what sort of guidance do you give in that kind of assignment?
I guess I can go ahead. In terms of assignments, I think within especially sort of seminar like classes that I do, we definitely do formal presentations, and we definitely include images within that, normally through PowerPoints or sometimes posters if they choose to do that. And we're getting better, I would say, at trying to experiment a little bit more with using images and those types of assignments. But again, kind of encouraging them as to how to put put images together to have them be impactful, and selecting different images. My hope, we also have a student journal here, and so one of my hopes is that we're going to start doing more photographic essays within that journal and having images used that way. And I can imagine that ArtStore would be a great source for that as well.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, I alluded to this final project, which is really the bread and butter assignment in this close looking course, other than that initial alien perspective exercise. And so students do present what they ended up choosing and working on to the class. And it's kind of a combination of, they might have handouts, they might have a PowerPoint, they could actually just do a demo with Artstor as well. But it's a multimedia assignment by design, in the sense that some students are more comfortable writing a research paper, and that's totally fine. They still have to be object oriented, so they have to do close looking at their cornerstone image that they've identified, and then they'll share that with the class. Many students love to make a digital exhibition, and so this is again where I work with librarians to introduce them to, they have various options for making a digital exhibition. Dartmouth has a kind of WordPress platform that they can use. Some of them have familiarity with Squarespace or another type of platform, and so it's really up to them to kind of figure out what works the best with their vision and what they're comfortable with. But we give them resources. So even if they're not great with computers, I mean, they're all great with computers to a certain extent, but they don't have to know how to code to make their exhibition come to life. And then students, as I mentioned, have the option to create something physical. And so, or a kind of artistic response to an object. And so for those, they're bringing their object to the last class and giving it to me physically, and then I analyze it along with a write-up that accompanies it, and then they get their object returned to them. So yeah, so we're still learning to be kind of nimble, working across formats.
Great. And I think just what time for one more, and that is, what advice would you give to educators new to using Artstor on JSTOR for building interdisciplinary connections in their teaching? And that, again, to both of our guests.
I would say don't be afraid to just experiment for yourself, but also experiment within the classroom. Like, you don't have to introduce it to your students knowing every in and out of the technology. It can be a really great in-class activity to learn together how to use it, how to use those filters, the different search functions. As I mentioned, it's the very active looking is a teachable moment too, and I think that applies to any sort of platform, but especially with something like Artstor that is so engaging visually for students.
Yeah, that's great. I think just sort of reminding students that the source base is ever expanding, and that legitimate sources are all over, and sort of we're not really limited, maybe as we would have been more traditionally in the past, in terms of what is considered to be a legitimate source. And so I think that databases and resources like Artstor will be very helpful towards that end, in teaching students how to do research and how to use these different types of resources.
All right, great. Well, thank you both once again for joining us today, and to everyone, all of our attendees, for coming to this webinar. As a reminder, you will receive a recording, attendees, as well as links to resources in a follow-up email in a couple of days. And after you exit the webinar, a survey will appear on your screen. In that survey, you can share feedback or express interest in Artstor on JSTOR for your institution. If you don't have time to do that survey right now, it will also be emailed to you within about an hour. And with that, we will sign off, and happy teaching.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.